I'm Celeste Hartwell. I'm 34 years old, and at my younger brother's wedding reception, at the prestigious Silverbrook Country Club, my own mother seated me at table 47 with the catering staff. Complete strangers in black aprons who looked as confused as I felt. Before I tell you how I stood up during the best man's speech as his direct supervisor, revealed his lies about being a successful executive, and watched 300 wedding guests learn that their family's failure daughter was actually the youngest regional director in Meridian Industries' 150-year history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me know in the comments what country you're watching from. It's incredible how stories about family dynamics and workplace hierarchies resonate across cultures and continents. This particular story started in the affluent suburbs of Willowcrest, Pennsylvale, but the lessons I learned that day have traveled with me everywhere since. You see, what happened at my brother Damien's wedding wasn't just about seating arrangements or family politics. It was the culmination of 34 years of being systematically positioned as the family disappointment, while my charming, underachieving brother was celebrated as the golden child. But more than that, it was about the moment when two completely separate worlds, my carefully constructed professional life and my deliberately diminished family role, collided in the most spectacular way possible. I had spent decades perfecting the art of being invisible at family gatherings. I'd learned to smile politely when relatives asked if I was still playing around with that little business job, while my brother Damien received standing ovations for basic life achievements, like keeping employment for 6 consecutive months, or remembering to send birthday cards. I'd mastered the technique of deflecting attention from my actual accomplishments, because any mention of my success was somehow interpreted as an attack on everyone else's comfort. What my family didn't know, what they had never bothered to ask about or investigate, was that my little business job involved overseeing a workforce of over 2,000 employees across 3 states. They didn't know that I had a corner office on the 47th floor of the Pinnacle Tower in downtown Millhaven, where CEOs of Fortune 500 companies regularly sought my expertise on operational efficiency and market expansion strategies. They didn't know that industry publications had featured me on their covers, or that I'd been invited to speak at international conferences about innovative leadership in the manufacturing sector. But most importantly, they didn't know that Damien's best man, Trevor Ashford, the guy he'd been bragging about for months as his incredibly successful friend who practically runs his company, was actually my direct report. Not just any direct report, but one whose employment was hanging by the thinnest of threads due to a series of performance issues, ethical violations, and what HR diplomatically called interpersonal challenges with authority figures. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. Here was Trevor, who had been spinning elaborate tales to my brother about his executive status and leadership responsibilities, planning to give a speech about success and achievement at a wedding where he'd specifically requested that I, his actual boss, be seated as far from the head table as physically possible. He'd even had the audacity to suggest to my brother that I might feel more comfortable sitting with people from my own professional level. What Trevor didn't realize was that I had been quietly documenting his behavior for months, not out of malice, but out of necessity. When someone consistently undermines team morale, misrepresents their authority to external clients, and attempts to take credit for other people's work, documentation becomes a survival tool. I had emails, recorded meetings, performance reviews, and incident reports that painted a very clear picture of exactly what kind of executive Trevor actually was. The wedding invitation had arrived 6 weeks earlier, embossed with gold lettering that announced the union of Damien Hartwell and Anastasia Corvelli at Silverbrook Country Club, the most exclusive venue in our area. My mother, Constance, had called me personally to discuss the seating arrangements, though discuss might be too generous a term for what was essentially a monologue about how I needed to understand that this day was about Damien and Anastasia, not about me trying to show off or make things awkward with my presence. She'd explained, in her particularly condescending tone, that they'd seated me at a table near the back with some of the service people because she thought I'd be more comfortable with working folks given my practical career path. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking, but not surprising. This was simply the latest evolution of a pattern that had been established when I was 7 years old and had been quietly collecting straight A's, while Damien charmed his way through school with C-minuses and detentions. What made this particular humiliation different was that it wasn't happening in the privacy of our family home, where witnesses were limited to immediate relatives who had long ago chosen their sides. This was happening in front of 300 people, Damien's friends, Anastasia's extensive family, business associates, and members of Willowcrest's social elite. My mother was making a public declaration about my worth, my place in the family hierarchy, and what she believed I deserved in terms of respect and recognition. But Constance had made one critical miscalculation. She had orchestrated this elaborate humiliation without knowing all the players on the board. She had positioned me exactly where she wanted me, isolated, diminished, and surrounded by people who were supposed to reinforce my status as the family's lesser child. What she hadn't factored into her strategy was that one of the key players in her son's celebration was someone whose professional reputation and future employment depended entirely on my discretion and approval. As I sat at table 47, watching the catering staff politely ignore the obvious awkwardness of my placement while my family laughed and celebrated at the head table, I felt the familiar calm that comes with having perfect information and unlimited options. This wasn't going to be another evening of quiet endurance and strategic retreat. This was going to be the night when 34 years of careful positioning and patient preparation finally paid dividends. Trevor had no idea that his boss was sitting 50 feet away, cataloging every embellishment in his pre-speech conversation with other guests about his leadership role and executive responsibilities. He had no idea that the woman his friend's family had dismissed as insignificant actually held the power to validate or destroy every professional claim he'd ever made. The evening was about to become very interesting indeed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Before I dive into exactly how this evening unfolded, I want to hear from all of you watching this. Drop a comment and let me know what country or city you're tuning in from. I'm constantly amazed by how these stories about workplace dynamics and family politics seem to transcend borders and cultures. Whether you're watching from Tokyo or Toronto, Lagos or London, I have a feeling you'll recognize some of the patterns I'm about to describe. It's fascinating how universal these experiences really are. The dynamics of being underestimated by your own family while excelling professionally, the awkwardness of workplace hierarchies colliding with personal relationships, the moment when someone's lies catch up with them in the most public way possible, these aren't just American suburban problems. These are human problems that play out in corporate boardrooms and family gatherings across every continent. I've received messages from viewers in over 40 countries telling me their own versions of this story. The software engineer in Mumbai whose family dismissed her career until they needed her help with their business technology. The marketing director in Sao Paulo whose relatives assumed she was a secretary until her billboard campaign made international news. The financial analyst in Stockholm whose family thought she worked at a bank branch until they discovered she was actually advising the bank's executive committee. What strikes me about all these stories is how often family perception lags decades behind professional reality. It's as if our relatives freeze us in time at whatever age we were when they decided who we were supposed to be. In their minds, I was still the serious, studious teenager who spent too much time reading business journals and not enough time socializing. They never updated their understanding to include the woman who had built strategic partnerships across 3 states, who had been headhunted by competing firms 6 times in the last 5 years, or who had been featured on the cover of Industrial Leadership Quarterly just 8 months before Damien's wedding. But here's what I find even more interesting. This isn't just about family dynamics. This is about the gap between perception and reality that exists in so many areas of our lives. How often do we assume we know someone's story based on limited information? How often do we underestimate people because they don't fit our expectations of what success looks like? The truth is, power and influence don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes the most significant people in the room are the ones who dress down instead of up, who listen more than they speak, who prefer competence over charisma. Trevor Ashford had spent months constructing an elaborate fiction about his professional status, because he believed that perception mattered more than performance. What he didn't understand was that in the real world, the world where quarterly reports and profit margins actually matter, substance always wins over style. I know some of you might be thinking that this sounds like it's heading toward a revenge story, and I understand why you might expect that. We've all fantasized about those moments when the people who've dismissed us finally see us for who we really are. But what happened at Damien's wedding wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about me trying to embarrass my family or destroy Trevor's reputation out of spite. It was about truth. It was about the moment when carefully maintained illusions collide with observable reality. It was about what happens when someone who has built their social standing on lies finds themselves in the same room as the person who knows exactly what those lies are worth. See, that's the thing about the modern professional world that people like my mother Constance and my brother Damien never quite grasped. In today's interconnected business environment, your reputation follows you everywhere. The executive assistant you dismissed as just a secretary might be the person who controls access to the CEO you're trying to impress. The quiet person at the conference mixer might be the venture capitalist who decides whether your startup gets funded. The woman sitting at table 47 with the catering staff might be the person who signs your paychecks and reviews your performance evaluations. This story isn't just about what happened to me at one wedding in Willowcrest. It's about the dangerous assumption that social hierarchies reflect professional realities. It's about the risk of treating people based on where they sit rather than what they accomplish. And it's about the inevitable moment when those assumptions meet the harsh light of actual facts. I want you to keep that in mind as I tell you what happened next, because the real lesson here isn't about the satisfaction of being vindicated. It's about the importance of treating every person with respect, regardless of where they're seated, because you never know who's really in charge of what. So grab your coffee or tea, settle in, and let me take you back to that evening at Silverbrook Country Club, where 3 decades of family assumptions were about to meet one very inconvenient truth about the real world of business and power. To understand what happened at Damien's wedding, you need to understand who I was on a typical Tuesday morning before any of this family drama entered the picture. Let me take you into my world, the one my family never bothered to learn about. My alarm goes off at 5:15 a.m. every weekday in my corner apartment on the 32nd floor of Meridian Towers, overlooking the Thornfield River. The first thing I do isn't check social media or scroll through news headlines. I open my tablet and review overnight reports from our manufacturing facilities in 3 different time zones. Our Eastport plant runs a skeleton night shift that handles urgent orders for our aerospace clients. Our Redstone facility processes raw materials that arrive by freight train from our suppliers in the mountain regions. Our newest facility in Bayside specializes in precision components for medical device manufacturers. By 5:45, I'm reviewing production metrics, quality control reports, and any incident summaries that require executive attention. Most mornings, this means everything is running smoothly. Our teams are exceptionally competent, and problems are usually resolved at the supervisory level before they reach my desk. But when issues do arise, a delayed shipment that could impact a client's launch schedule, a quality variance that requires immediate investigation, or a personnel situation that needs careful handling, I need to be prepared to make decisions that affect thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in contracts. My coffee routine is precise. Ethiopian single-origin beans, ground fresh, French press for exactly 4 minutes. I drink it black while standing at my floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city wake up 40 floors below. There's something calming about seeing the world from this height, where individual problems become part of larger patterns, where you can observe systems working together instead of getting lost in the chaos of street-level details. By 6:30, I'm in my private gym, a converted second bedroom with commercial-grade equipment. 45 minutes of focused training, cardio on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, strength training on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Physical fitness isn't vanity for me, it's operational necessity. Leading a company requires mental clarity, emotional resilience, and the physical stamina to work 12-hour days when situations demand it. My drive to the office takes me through downtown Millhaven, past the historic district where century-old brick buildings house trendy startups and artisanal coffee shops, through the financial quarter where glass towers reflect the morning sun, and finally into the industrial district where Meridian Industries has anchored the local economy for 6 generations. The Pinnacle Tower isn't just our headquarters. It's a landmark visible from 20 miles away, a symbol of engineering excellence and economic stability that employs 15% of the region's workforce. The executive elevator requires both a key card and biometric scanning. Most mornings, I'm the first executive to arrive, which means I have 30 minutes of complete quiet to review overnight communications from our international partners, approve budget allocations, and prepare for the day's strategic decisions. My assistant, Catherine Pemberton, arrives at 7:45 with a briefing folder that contains everything requiring my immediate attention: contract approvals, personnel recommendations, client meeting summaries, and regulatory compliance updates. Catherine has been with Meridian for 12 years, and with me personally for the last 4. She's more than an assistant. She's an operational coordinator who manages information flow across 6 departments. When plant managers in different states need to coordinate shipping schedules, Catherine handles the logistics. When our legal team needs technical specifications for patent applications, Catherine ensures the right engineers get the right information at the right time. When board members request performance data for quarterly reviews, Catherine compiles reports that would take other executives weeks to assemble. My office occupies the southeast corner of the 47th floor, with windows facing both the river and the mountain range beyond the city limits. The walls display photographs from facility openings, awards from industry associations, and handwritten thank-you notes from employees whose children's college educations were funded by our scholarship program. The only personal photograph is a small framed picture of my grandmother, Celeste Hartwell, who founded this company in 1874, with nothing but a contract to manufacture railroad components, and an unshakable belief that excellence would always find its market. Most people assume that reaching executive level means sitting in meetings all day, reviewing PowerPoint presentations, and making abstract decisions about numbers on spreadsheets. The reality is much more hands-on. I spend Tuesday mornings in our research and development lab, working directly with engineers who are developing next-generation manufacturing processes. I spend Wednesday afternoons on production floors, talking with shift supervisors about efficiency improvements and safety protocols. Thursday mornings are reserved for one-on-one meetings with department heads who need strategic guidance or approval for major initiatives. The complexity of modern manufacturing means that my decisions impact supply chains that stretch across 4 countries, environmental compliance standards that require constant monitoring, and technological innovations that position us ahead of competitors who are constantly trying to replicate our processes. When I approve a new product line, I'm not just saying yes to an idea. I'm committing millions of dollars in equipment purchases, hundreds of hours of employee training, and our company's reputation for delivering what we promise when we promise it. What makes this even more interesting is that none of our competitors know that Meridian's youngest regional director is a woman. Industry conferences and trade publications typically feature photographs of our male executives, partly because they've been with the company longer, and partly because traditional manufacturing still operates with certain assumptions about who makes major decisions. I prefer it this way. It means competitors underestimate our capabilities, while clients focus on our results rather than our demographics. My approach to leadership prioritizes competence over charisma, systems over personalities, and long-term sustainability over short-term profits. I inherited these values from my grandmother's business philosophy, refined them through an MBA program at Kensington University, and proved them effective through 8 years of consistent growth in market share and employee satisfaction ratings. This is the world I inhabit from Monday through Friday, a world where precision matters, where decisions have measurable consequences, where respect is earned through demonstrated competence rather than social positioning. It's a world my family has never seen, never asked about, and never understood. To them, I'm still the serious little girl who preferred reading to parties, who chose practical clothes over fashionable ones, who valued achievement over popularity. What they didn't realize was that all those qualities they found so disappointing had actually prepared me perfectly for the challenges of running a complex organization in a competitive industry. And more importantly, they didn't realize that the quiet, methodical approach that made me seem boring at family gatherings had also made me very, very good at recognizing exactly when someone was lying about their professional credentials. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while I was reviewing quarterly safety reports in my office. Catherine buzzed through on the intercom with that particular tone she uses when someone from my family is on the line, carefully neutral, professionally polite, but with just enough hesitation to let me know this isn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "Ms. Hartwell, your mother is holding on line 2. She says it's regarding your brother's wedding arrangements." I glanced at my watch, 2:47 p.m. In the middle of a workday, during what Constance knew were my peak operational hours. This wasn't coincidence. This was strategy. She had a talent for timing her calls to maximize inconvenience, as if catching me busy somehow proved that my work wasn't as important as whatever family matter required immediate attention. "Thank you, Catherine, I'll take it." The line clicked through, and my mother's voice filled the office with that particular blend of artificial sweetness and underlying steel that I'd learned to decode decades ago. "Celeste, darling, I hope I'm not interrupting anything too important." The emphasis on too important was subtle but unmistakable. In Constance's world, nothing I did could possibly be important enough to justify keeping her waiting. "What can I help you with, Mother?" "Well, I'm calling about the seating arrangements for Damien's reception." You know how these things are. So many details to coordinate, so many relationships to consider. I want to make sure everyone feels comfortable and appropriately placed. I set down my pen and leaned back in my chair, watching a cargo ship navigate the river 47 floors below. When Constance started talking about making people feel comfortable and appropriately placed, it usually meant she was about to deliver news that would be neither. "I'm listening." "Now, I know you've been looking forward to this celebration, and of course we want you there. Family is family, after all. But I've been thinking about the dynamics, about what would work best for everyone involved, and I believe I've found the perfect solution." The pause stretched long enough for her to take what I imagined was a fortifying sip of her afternoon wine. Constance had elevated the art of delivering bad news to an almost theatrical performance, complete with dramatic timing and carefully modulated vocal inflections. You see, most of the head tables are reserved for the wedding party, immediate family, and Anastasia's relatives from Italy. Very formal, very traditional people who take these protocol matters quite seriously. Then we have tables for Damien's business associates, college friends, that sort of thing. All very established social circles. I could feel the conversation heading toward its inevitable destination, but I let her continue. Sometimes it was more informative to hear how someone chose to justify their actions than to interrupt them with questions. "So I've arranged for you to sit at table 47 near the service area. I thought you'd actually prefer it there. Much more relaxed, less pressure to make small talk with people you don't know." And honestly, darling, I think you'll find the conversation more appropriate to your interests. Table 47, I repeated, keeping my voice carefully neutral. Near the service area. Exactly, with some of the catering staff and a few of the venue coordinators. Working people, you know. I thought you'd feel more comfortable with folks who understand what it's like to have a regular job, rather than trying to keep up with conversations about investments and business ownership and all those complicated topics that Damien's friends discuss. The insult was so perfectly crafted that I had to admire its construction. In a single conversation, Constance had managed to dismiss my education, my professional achievements, and my social capabilities, while positioning herself as thoughtful and considerate. She had reduced me to someone who needed to be protected from complicated business discussions and who would naturally gravitate towards service workers because that's where I supposedly belonged in the social hierarchy. I see. And who else will be at the head table? Oh, the usual suspects. The wedding party, of course. Anastasia's parents. Lovely people, very successful in the restaurant business. Her brother and his wife, both doctors. Damien's best man Trevor and his date. Such a impressive young man, actually. Did you know he's practically running his own company now? Damien's been telling everyone about Trevor's executive position and all the important decisions he makes. Really quite accomplished for someone so young. The mention of Trevor Ashford hit me like cold water. I sat up straighter in my chair, my attention suddenly laser-focused on every word my mother was saying. Trevor Ashford, I said carefully, Damien's best man. Yes, such a success story. Damien met him at that networking event last year. You know how good your brother is at making connections with the right sort of people? Trevor's been mentoring Damien on career development, giving him advice about climbing the corporate ladder. He has such insight into how these big companies really operate. I reached for my laptop and quickly pulled up our employee database, typing in Trevor's name while my mother continued her monologue about his supposed achievements. He's been telling us the most fascinating stories about executive strategy and leadership challenges. Really impressive for someone who's barely 30. Damien says Trevor practically runs day-to-day operations at his company, makes all the important decisions, supervises entire departments. It's wonderful to see young people taking on such responsibility. Trevor Ashford's personnel file filled my screen. Hired 18 months ago as a mid-level sales coordinator, currently under performance review for misrepresenting client relationships, recently disciplined for attempting to exceed his authority in contract negotiations, and scheduled for a final warning meeting with HR next week regarding his tendency to inflate his role when speaking with external contacts. And Trevor specifically requested that I sit at table 47? Well, not specifically you, darling. He just suggested that it might be more appropriate to seat certain family members with people from similar professional backgrounds. He's very thoughtful about these social dynamics, being an executive himself. He understands how awkward it can be when people don't have much in common professionally. The pieces fell into place with crystalline clarity. Trevor had somehow learned that I would be attending the wedding, had probably heard my name mentioned in connection with business or work, and had made assumptions about my professional status based on how my own family discussed my career. He had suggested seating arrangements that would keep me safely isolated from conversations where his carefully constructed lies about his executive status might be challenged by someone with actual knowledge of his performance. I'm sure Trevor knows what he's talking about, I said, my voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline coursing through my system. When is the wedding again? Saturday evening, 6 o'clock ceremony, reception immediately following. I do hope you'll make an effort with your appearance, darling. I know you prefer those practical outfits, but this is a formal affair. Try to find something that doesn't look quite so professional. After hanging up, I sat in my office for several minutes, watching the late afternoon shadows lengthen across the city below. Catherine appeared in my doorway with a cup of tea, and the knowing expression of someone who had overheard enough phone conversations to recognize when family dynamics were about to intersect with professional realities in interesting ways. Everything all right, Ms. Hartwell? Catherine, I need you to pull together some documents for me. Everything we have on Trevor Ashford. Performance reviews, disciplinary actions, email communications, the works. Also, please confirm my attendance at the Hartwell-Corvelli wedding this Saturday and arrange for my formal car service. Certainly. Should I prepare anything specific for your weekend schedule? I smiled, feeling the familiar calm that comes with having all the information necessary to make strategic decisions. Actually, yes. Please make sure my navy blue Armani suit is pressed and ready, the one with the Meridian Industries executive pin. And Catherine? Clear my Monday morning schedule. I have a feeling I'm going to need time to handle some personnel matters. That phone call about the seating arrangements wasn't an isolated incident. It was simply the latest evolution of a pattern that had been established when I was 8 years old and Damien was 6. Sitting around our grandmother Elena's mahogany dining table during one of her legendary Sunday dinners. I remember the exact moment when the family narrative crystallized into something permanent and toxic. Elena had been asking us about school, and I had excitedly shared news about winning the regional science fair with my project on renewable energy systems. It was a big deal. I'd beaten kids from schools across 3 counties, and the judges had been particularly impressed with my methodology and presentation skills. Damien, not to be outdone, announced that he had been chosen as line leader for his class that week, not for academic achievement, not for leadership qualities, but essentially by random rotation. Our grandmother, Constance, and Uncle Raymond all burst into applause for Damien's accomplishment, while my science fair victory was acknowledged with a polite, "That's nice, dear," before the conversation immediately shifted to how charming Damien looked in his little school uniform. That was the moment I learned that in our family, Damien's mediocre achievements would always overshadow my exceptional ones, not because his were more impressive, but because his were non-threatening. My success implied that academic excellence was possible, which made other family members uncomfortable about their own educational choices. Damien's success, however minor, felt safe and celebratory because it didn't challenge anyone's self-perception. The pattern repeated itself throughout our childhood with disturbing consistency. When I graduated valedictorian from Willowcrest Academy, the family celebration lasted exactly as long as it took to read the announcement. When Damien passed his driver's test on the 3rd attempt, they threw him a party and bought him a car. When I received a full scholarship to Kensington University's business program, Uncle Raymond made a joke about how book smart doesn't necessarily translate to life smart. When Damien barely graduated high school, they praised his, quote, resilience and determination. The most painful example came during my sophomore year at university. I had been selected for an exclusive internship program with Meridian Industries, the same company my grandmother had built from nothing, though none of them realized the connection at the time. It was an unprecedented opportunity for someone my age, involving direct mentorship with senior executives and real responsibility for strategic projects. I drove home that weekend, bursting with excitement about sharing this news with my family. I found them in the living room, where Damien was regaling everyone with stories about his new job as a part-time sales associate at an electronics store in the mall. He was describing his employee discount and his plan to work his way up to assistant manager as if he were outlining a path to the CEO position of a Fortune 500 company. When I mentioned my internship, Constance's immediate response was concern about whether this extra work would interfere with my studies. When I explained that it was actually a prestigious opportunity that could launch my career, she worried aloud about whether I was taking on too much and putting unnecessary pressure on myself. The subtext was clear. Damien's retail job was a normal, healthy step toward independence, while my corporate internship was somehow evidence of my compulsive overachievement. But the real pattern wasn't just about different standards for different children. It was about active sabotage disguised as protection. During my junior year, when I was being recruited by several top-tier consulting firms, Constance began a campaign of subtle undermining that was breathtaking in its sophistication. She would call my apartment during crucial study periods, ostensibly to check in, but actually to create lengthy conversations about family drama that would derail my focus for hours. She would schedule important family events, anniversary dinners, holiday celebrations, cousins' graduations, during weekends when I had explicitly told her I needed to prepare for major presentations or final exams. When I would express frustration about these conflicts, she would respond with hurt feelings and implications that I was prioritizing my career obsession over family relationships. The emotional manipulation was so perfectly calibrated that I often found myself apologizing for having academic responsibilities, as if pursuing excellence was a form of selfishness that required family forgiveness. Meanwhile, Damien's schedule was treated with reverence. His shifts at the electronics store were considered sacred commitments that could never be rescheduled. His plans with friends were important social development that shouldn't be interrupted. His need for quiet time to play video games was respected as legitimate stress relief, while my need for quiet time to study was seen as antisocial behavior that proved I was becoming too serious and losing touch with what really mattered in life. The most insidious part of this dynamic was how it trained me to minimize my own achievements. I learned to downplay good news, to present successes as lucky accidents rather than earned victories, to deflect attention from my accomplishments, because any celebration of my work seemed to cause family tension. I became expert at making myself smaller so that others could feel larger. When I graduated summa cum laude and was immediately hired by Meridian Industries as a management trainee, I told my family simply that I had found a job at a local company. When I was promoted to department supervisor within 18 months, I mentioned it in passing as some additional responsibilities. When I became the youngest division manager in company history, I said nothing at all, because I had learned that my professional growth was something my family preferred not to know about. This wasn't just neglect or indifference. This was active, coordinated effort to maintain a family structure where Damien was the success story, and I was the cautionary tale about what happens when someone gets too big for their britches. Every family gathering reinforced this narrative. Every conversation steered away from my career and toward Damien's latest adventure in underachievement disguised as colorful life experience. The sophisticated cruelty of it was that they never actually said I was worthless. Instead, they expressed constant concern about my intensity, my unrealistic expectations, my tendency to complicate simple things. They worried that I was missing out on the real joys of life, relationships, leisure, spontaneity, by focusing too much on professional advancement. They positioned themselves as loving family members trying to save me from my own driven nature. But what they were really doing was protecting themselves from the uncomfortable reality that I had built something significant while they had remained static. My continued growth forced them to confront their own choices, their own limitations, their own comfort with mediocrity. It was easier to pathologize my ambition than to examine their own lack of it. The wedding seating arrangement was simply the latest iteration of this decades-long campaign. By placing me with the service staff, Constance was making a public statement about where I belonged in the family hierarchy and in society generally. She was announcing to 300 wedding guests that despite whatever job title I might have, I was fundamentally someone who belonged with the help rather than with the people who mattered. What made this particular insult especially perfect was that it had been orchestrated with input from Trevor Ashford, a man whose entire relationship with my brother was built on lies about professional success. Trevor had positioned himself as Damien's mentor and career advisor, sharing wisdom about executive leadership and corporate strategy that he had never actually experienced. And now he was advising my family about appropriate seating arrangements based on his assessment of my professional status. The irony was so complete it felt intentional. Here was my family, taking career advice from someone whose employment hung by a thread, using his guidance to humiliate their own daughter who happened to be his boss. They were so invested in maintaining their narrative about my limitations that they had enlisted the help of someone whose professional incompetence I dealt with on a weekly basis. As I sat in my office that Thursday afternoon, reviewing the documentation Catherine had assembled about Trevor's performance issues, I realized that this wedding was going to be more than just another family gathering, where I practiced the art of invisible endurance. This was going to be the collision of two completely separate worlds: the world where I was a family disappointment and the world where I was an executive authority. For the first time in 34 years, those worlds were going to meet in the same room, at the same time, with witnesses who could observe both versions of reality simultaneously. And Trevor Ashford, who had orchestrated my humiliation based on his assumptions about my professional insignificance, was going to discover exactly how wrong those assumptions were. That Thursday evening, I sat in my apartment overlooking the Thornfield River, watching the city lights reflect off the water while I made the most important strategic decision of my personal life. The Trevor Ashford personnel file lay open on my coffee table next to a glass of wine I hadn't touched, and my laptop displayed the detailed wedding information Catherine had efficiently compiled within hours of my request. For 34 years, I had chosen the path of least resistance with my family. I had absorbed their insults, minimized my achievements, and perfected the art of strategic invisibility at family gatherings. Every time they diminished me, I had retreated further into my professional world, building higher walls between my real life and their perception of my life. It had been a survival strategy that worked beautifully, until now. But this situation was fundamentally different from every previous family humiliation. This wasn't just about Constance's need to position me as the family failure, or about Damien's requirement that his achievements be celebrated without comparison to mine. This was about a direct intersection between my professional responsibilities and my personal relationships, orchestrated by someone who was actively deceiving both sides. Trevor Ashford had created a vulnerability that extended beyond family dynamics into corporate liability. His lies about his executive status weren't just harmless social climbing. They were potential grounds for termination, ethical violations that could impact Meridian Industries' reputation, and deliberate misrepresentation of his authority to external contacts. The fact that he had used these fabricated credentials to advise my family about my professional status made his deception both personal and professional misconduct. I could have chosen the familiar path. I could have attended the wedding, endured the humiliation of Table 47, smiled politely while Trevor gave his best man speech about success and achievement, and returned to my regular life with another story about family dysfunction to share with my therapist. It would have been easier, safer, and completely consistent with 34 years of conflict avoidance. But something had fundamentally shifted in my thinking that afternoon. Maybe it was the casual cruelty of my mother's assumption that I belonged with working people, because I couldn't handle complicated business conversations. Maybe it was the revelation that Trevor had specifically orchestrated my exile to protect his own fraudulent narrative. Or maybe it was simply the recognition that I had spent 3 decades allowing people to define my worth based on their own insecurities and limitations. The turning point came when I realized that my continued silence wasn't just enabling family dysfunction, it was enabling professional misconduct that could affect other people's careers and livelihoods. Trevor's pattern of misrepresenting his authority wasn't limited to wedding conversations with my brother. Our HR documentation showed multiple instances where he had exceeded his actual responsibilities in communications with clients, vendors, and industry contacts. His behavior was escalating, and my personal reluctance to confront family-adjacent conflicts was allowing corporate problems to grow unchecked. I opened my laptop and began drafting what I privately called my strategic assessment. Not a plan for revenge or public humiliation, but a careful analysis of objectives, resources, and optimal outcomes for a complex situation that required precise handling. The primary objective wasn't to embarrass my family or destroy Trevor's reputation out of spite. It was to establish truth as the foundation for all future interactions. For 34 years, my family had operated under the assumption that they could control my narrative, define my worth, and manage my role in their social structure, without any accountability for the accuracy of their assessments. This assumption had never been challenged, because I had never provided them with information that contradicted their preferred version of reality. Trevor's involvement had created an opportunity to demonstrate, with irrefutable evidence and credible witnesses, exactly who I was professionally and what I had accomplished. More importantly, it provided a chance to establish new boundaries that would prevent future incidents of this type. If my family was going to make public statements about my professional status, they needed to base those statements on facts rather than assumptions. The secondary objective was to address Trevor's professional misconduct in a way that was both appropriate to the corporate setting and fair to all parties involved. His pattern of misrepresentation couldn't continue, but his termination needed to be handled through proper channels with appropriate documentation. The wedding situation provided an opportunity to gather additional evidence of his willingness to exceed his authority and misrepresent his role to external contacts. I reviewed the resources available to me. Catherine had assembled a complete file of Trevor's employment history, performance evaluations, and disciplinary actions. I had personal knowledge of his current projects, his actual responsibilities, and his recent performance issues. I had access to company documentation that could verify or refute any claims he might make about his executive status or decision-making authority. More importantly, I had professional credibility that extended far beyond Meridian Industries. The wedding guest list included several business leaders who knew my reputation in the manufacturing sector, including David Rothschild from Pinnacle Financial Services, who had been courting Meridian as a potential client for 18 months, and Elizabeth Cavendish from Industrial Development Partners, who had specifically requested my participation in a regional economic development initiative. These weren't just networking contacts. They were professional peers who could provide immediate, authoritative validation of my actual role and accomplishments if the situation required it. Their presence at the wedding meant that any public discussion of professional credentials would occur in front of people qualified to assess the accuracy of those credentials. Their risk assessment was equally important. Confronting Trevor publicly could potentially damage my relationship with Damien, although that relationship was already strained by years of one-sided accommodation. It could create family drama that extended beyond the wedding itself, though the current family dynamics were already dysfunctional and unsustainable. It could result in professional awkwardness if Trevor chose to contest his employment status, though his documented performance issues made his position vulnerable regardless of wedding events. The potential benefits, however, significantly outweighed the risks. Establishing my actual professional status would end decades of family assumptions about my capabilities and achievements. It would create an opportunity for healthier relationships based on accurate information rather than willful ignorance. It would address Trevor's professional misconduct in a way that was both appropriate and decisive. And it would demonstrate to my family that their narrative control had limits that they had finally exceeded. The methodology became clear as I outlined the approach. I would attend the wedding exactly as planned, sitting at table 47 with perfect professional composure. I would allow Trevor to give his best man speech about success, achievement, and executive leadership without interruption. I would let him establish his credentials publicly, in front of witnesses who could verify his claims. And then, when the appropriate moment presented itself, I would stand up and correct the record with the same calm precision I used in board meetings and client presentations. This wasn't about dramatic confrontation or emotional satisfaction. This was about information management, expectation setting, and strategic communication under challenging circumstances. It was about applying the same professional skills that had made me successful in business to a personal situation that required those skills. I closed the laptop and finally took a sip of wine, watching the late evening traffic move along the Riverside Highway below. Saturday was going to be interesting, but for the first time in 34 years, I was going to enter a family gathering with complete information, clear objectives, and a strategic plan that prioritized truth over comfort. The decision was made. I was going to stop being invisible and start being exactly who I had always been, just in front of the people who had never bothered to look. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes strategic thinking feel effortless. I arrived at the office an hour earlier than usual, not because I had more work than normal, but because I needed uninterrupted time to execute the intelligence-gathering phase of my weekend plan. Catherine found me at my desk with 3 empty coffee cups and a spreadsheet that would have impressed a military logistics coordinator. "Good morning, Ms. Hartwell. I see you've been busy. Should I be concerned about what you're planning?" Catherine had developed an almost supernatural ability to read my moods and intentions after 4 years of managing my complex schedule. She could tell the difference between routine preparation and strategic preparation, and this morning definitely fell into the latter category. "Not concerned, Catherine. Prepared. I need you to help me gather some additional information, and I need you to make a few very discreet phone calls." I handed her a list of names I had compiled from the wedding guest information. These weren't random selections. They were carefully chosen individuals whose professional relationships with me could provide crucial context for tomorrow evening's events. "First, I need you to confirm attendance for these 5 people. Don't mention my name specifically, just call as a representative of Meridian Industries confirming details for corporate gift deliveries or something equally routine. I need to know who will actually be there tomorrow." The list included David Rothschild from Pinnacle Financial Services, Elizabeth Cavendish from Industrial Development Partners, Thomas Aldridge from Regional Manufacturing Council, Patricia Blackstone from Thornfield Economic Development Authority, and James Morrison from the State Department of Industrial Relations. Each of these individuals had worked with me directly on major projects over the past 2 years. Each could speak authoritatively about my role, my responsibilities, and my professional reputation. Second, I need you to prepare information packets about Meridian Industries' recent projects and achievements. Nothing confidential, just the public information that would normally be shared with potential clients or industry partners. Include my biography from the company website, the recent feature article from Industrial Leadership Quarterly, and the press release about our expansion into the Bayside facility. Catherine nodded, making notes with the efficiency of someone who had handled unusual requests before. "Should I prepare enough copies for the entire wedding party?" "Just 5 copies in unmarked folders. I'm not planning to distribute company literature at a wedding reception. I'm planning to have accurate information available if professional credentials become a topic of conversation." The third item on my list required more delicate handling. I need you to contact our legal department and request a formal summary of our employee handbook policies regarding external representation of company roles and responsibilities, specifically the sections that address misrepresentation of authority, unauthorized claims about decision-making responsibilities, and proper protocols for discussing company business in social settings. Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly. This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain employee whose performance review is scheduled for Monday morning? It might. Trevor Ashford has apparently been representing himself as an executive with significant decision-making authority. I need to understand our legal position if his external claims about his role become a matter of public record. Understood. Anything else? Yes. I need you to schedule a lunch meeting with someone, but this one requires absolute discretion. Contact Victoria Ashbrook at the Willowcrest Chamber of Commerce and ask if she can meet me today at the Riverside Bistro at 1 o'clock. Tell her it's regarding a potential partnership opportunity between Meridian Industries and local business development initiatives. Victoria Ashbrook was more than just the Chamber of Commerce director. She was the unofficial information hub for business and social connections throughout the Willowcrest area. If anyone would know the background on Trevor Ashford's social climbing efforts, his relationship with my brother, and the conversations that had led to my exile to Table 47, it would be Victoria. The lunch meeting proved even more illuminating than I had anticipated. Victoria arrived with her characteristic combination of professional competence and barely contained curiosity about why Meridian Industries' youngest regional director wanted to discuss partnership opportunities less than 24 hours before attending a family wedding. "Celeste, I have to say I'm intrigued by this meeting. We've been trying to get Meridian more involved in local business development for years, and suddenly you're available for lunch on short notice. Should I be excited or suspicious? Probably both, I replied, appreciating her directness. I'm interested in understanding the local business networking landscape, particularly how young professionals establish connections and build reputations in our community. Victoria's expression shifted to something between amusement and recognition. This wouldn't have anything to do with tomorrow's Hartwell-Corvelli wedding, would it? Because I have to tell you, there's been some interesting conversation in our business circles lately about family dynamics and professional achievements. What kind of conversation? Well, your brother Damien has been attending our young professionals networking events for the past 6 months, always with his friend Trevor Ashford. Trevor's been quite vocal about his executive role and his mentorship of Damien on career development strategies. He's given several informal presentations about corporate leadership and decision-making processes. I leaned forward slightly. What kind of presentations? Oh, the usual executive development topics. Strategic planning, team management, budget authority, client relationship development. He's positioned himself as someone with significant experience in these areas, someone who can guide other young professionals towards similar success. Victoria paused to take a sip of her wine, clearly enjoying the opportunity to share information with someone who might appreciate its full significance. The interesting part is how he's been discussing your family situation. He's mentioned that he's advised your parents about appropriate social positioning for family members with different professional backgrounds. He's suggested that successful executives sometimes need to make difficult decisions about maintaining appropriate boundaries with relatives who might not understand corporate culture. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Trevor had not only misrepresented his own professional status, but had used that fabricated authority to advise my family about my social positioning. He had positioned himself as the expert on corporate success while recommending that I be excluded from conversations about business and achievement. Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I need your complete discretion about this conversation. Of course. In your professional opinion, based on your experience with business development and corporate partnerships, what would happen if someone who had been representing themselves as an executive with significant decision-making authority was publicly revealed to be a mid-level employee under performance review? Victoria set down her wine glass and studied my face carefully. Are we talking hypothetically, or are we talking about Trevor Ashford specifically? We're talking about professional ethics and the importance of accurate representation in business relationships. Well, hypothetically speaking, that kind of misrepresentation could seriously damage someone's credibility not just with current networking contacts but with potential future employers. Business communities are smaller than people think, and reputations travel quickly. If someone had been giving career advice based on fabricated credentials, it would reflect poorly on their judgment and their integrity. She leaned back in her chair, clearly putting pieces together. Celeste, may I ask what your actual role is at Meridian Industries? Because I've heard various descriptions over the years, and I'm starting to think there might be some significant gaps between perception and reality. I pulled out one of the information packets Catherine had prepared and handed it across the table. Victoria opened it and began reading, her expression shifting from curiosity to surprise to something approaching awe. You're the youngest regional director in company history. You oversee operations across 3 states. You've been featured on the cover of industry publications. She looked up at me with newly focused attention. And tomorrow you're sitting at table 47 with the catering staff, while Trevor Ashford gives a speech about executive success from the head table. Correct. That's either the most elaborate practical joke I've ever heard of, or your family has some serious misconceptions about your professional status. Also, correct. Victoria closed the folder and sat back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. Celeste, tomorrow evening is going to be very interesting. Is there anything specific you need from me? Just be yourself, Victoria. If conversations about professional credentials arise, I trust your judgment about what information might be relevant to share. As I drove back to the office, I felt the familiar satisfaction that comes with thorough preparation and strategic positioning. I had confirmed the attendance of 5 industry colleagues who could verify my professional status. I had documentation that established both my actual achievements and company policies regarding misrepresentation. Most importantly, I had gained insight into the full scope of Trevor's deception and its impact on my family's social positioning. The pieces were in place. Tomorrow evening, truth would finally have the opportunity to compete with fiction on equal terms, in front of witnesses qualified to judge the difference. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that wedding planners dream about. Crisp air, brilliant blue skies, and golden afternoon light that would make even the most amateur photographer look competent. I spent the morning in my usual routine, deliberately maintaining the calm precision that had carried me through every major business challenge of the past decade. By 4:30, I was dressed in my navy Armani suit, with the subtle Meridian Industries executive pin, positioned exactly where industry colleagues would notice it, driving towards Silverbrook Country Club, with the quiet confidence of someone who had done their homework. The club's circular driveway was already crowded with luxury vehicles when I arrived: Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, and the occasional Tesla that announced their owner's commitment to both affluence and environmental consciousness. I handed my keys to the valet, a young man who automatically assumed I was part of the catering staff until he noticed my suit and corrected himself with nervous politeness. "Good evening, ma'am. Enjoy the celebration." The first indication that this evening would unfold exactly as I had anticipated came when I approached the reception table to collect my seating assignment. The volunteer managing check-in, a perfectly coiffed woman in her 50s wearing a string of pearls that cost more than most people's monthly salary, consulted her list with theatrical efficiency. "Name, please?" "Celeste Hartwell." Her finger traced down the alphabetized list, paused, then moved to a separate section at the bottom of the page. "Oh, yes, here you are. Table 47. She handed me a small card and pointed toward the back corner of the reception area. "Just past the service station, near the kitchen doors." I accepted the card with perfect composure, noting that she had avoided making eye contact after discovering my table assignment. Even the volunteers had been briefed about my exile. The ceremony itself was surprisingly beautiful. Damien looked genuinely happy standing at the altar in his perfectly fitted tuxedo, and Anastasia was radiant in a gown that probably cost more than my first car. I sat in the back row of the chapel, observing the proceedings with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying social rituals. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union, I remained appropriately silent, though I noted Trevor Ashford's smug expression from his position as best man. The cocktail hour provided my first direct encounter with the evening's dramatis personae. I had positioned myself near the bar, nursing a glass of champagne and observing the social dynamics, when my mother approached with the determined stride of someone who had been drinking wine since 3 o'clock. "Celeste, darling, you look professional." The pause before professional was loaded with enough subtext to fill a psychology textbook. "I hope you'll remember that tonight is about Damien and Anastasia, not about drawing attention to yourself." "Of course, Mother. I'm here to celebrate their happiness." "Good. I was worried you might feel out of place. These are very successful people, very accomplished. I'd hate for you to feel overwhelmed by the conversation level." Before I could respond, she was interrupted by a familiar voice from behind me. "Celeste Hartwell, I was hoping I'd run into you tonight." I turned to find David Rothschild approaching with his characteristic combination of professional warmth and genuine enthusiasm. David had been courting Meridian Industries as a potential client for over a year, and our quarterly meetings had evolved into something approaching friendship based on mutual respect and shared expertise in operational efficiency. "David, wonderful to see you. I didn't realize you knew the Corvelli family. Anastasia's father and I serve on the board of the Regional Business Development Council together. Outstanding family, very impressive operation they've built." He gestured toward the elaborate reception setup. Speaking of impressive operations, I've been meaning to call you about the expansion into Bayside. The financial projections we discussed last month are absolutely fascinating. My mother's expression shifted from confused to concerned as she realized that this well-dressed stranger was discussing business matters with me as if I were someone whose opinions actually mattered. "I'm sorry," Constance interjected with her practiced social smile. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Celeste's mother, Constance Hartwell." "David Rothschild, Pinnacle Financial Services. Your daughter has been instrumental in several of our most successful regional development initiatives. We're hoping to formalize our partnership with Meridian Industries next quarter." The word partnership hit Constance like cold water. In her carefully constructed social hierarchy, partnerships were arrangements between equals. And the idea that anyone would want to partner with her disappointing daughter challenged fundamental assumptions about how the world operated. "That's nice," she managed, though her tone suggested she found it anything but nice. "I'm sure Celeste appreciates the opportunity to learn from more experienced professionals." David's eyebrows rose slightly. "Learn?" "Mrs. Hartwell, your daughter has been teaching us. Her operational efficiency models have become the standard for our entire client portfolio. We regularly recommend other companies study Meridian's approach to strategic expansion." I watched my mother's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching panic as she processed this information. Before she could formulate a response, another voice joined our conversation. "Celeste, there you are. I've been looking all over for you." Elizabeth Cavendish appeared at my elbow with the kind of focused energy that had made her one of the most respected business development professionals in the region. Elizabeth and I had collaborated on 3 major industrial development projects over the past 18 months, and her presence at tonight's gathering was another piece of strategic positioning falling perfectly into place. "Elizabeth, lovely to see you. Do you know my mother, Constance Hartwell?" "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Hartwell. You must be incredibly proud of Celeste's achievements. The manufacturing sector recognition she received last spring was absolutely unprecedented for someone her age." Constance's wine glass trembled slightly in her hand. "Recognition?" "The Industrial Leadership Excellence Award. Youngest recipient in the program's 40-year history." Her keynote presentation about sustainable manufacturing practices had the entire conference on their feet. We still reference her operational frameworks in our strategic planning sessions. I maintained perfect composure while watching my mother's carefully constructed reality begin to develop stress fractures. For 34 years, she had operated under the assumption that she understood the scope and significance of my professional life. The discovery that industry leaders knew details about my career that she had never heard was clearly causing some fundamental recalibration of her worldview. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of wedding coordinators announcing that guests should move into the reception area for dinner service. As we walked toward the ballroom, I noticed Trevor Ashford holding court near the head table, regaling a small group of wedding guests with what appeared to be an animated discussion about executive leadership strategies. "The key to successful team management," I heard him saying as we passed, "is understanding that authority has to be earned through demonstrated competence and strategic thinking. Too many people assume that having a job title means you're qualified to make important decisions." The irony was so perfect it felt choreographed. Here was Trevor, whose actual job responsibilities involved processing sales orders and updating customer contact information, lecturing wedding guests about the relationship between authority and competence, while I walked past wearing the suit of someone who actually possessed both. As I approached table 47, I found my assigned companions for the evening, 3 members of the catering staff who looked as uncomfortable about the seating arrangement as I felt vindicated by it, the wedding photographer's assistant, and 2 women who introduced themselves as distant relatives of the bride with apologetic explanations that they didn't really know anyone here. The catering supervisor, a woman named Rosa, who possessed the kind of professional competence I recognized and respected, leaned over as I sat down. "I have to ask, are you actually supposed to be sitting here? Because this seems like some kind of mistake." "Not a mistake," I replied, accepting a glass of wine from a passing server. Just a case of strategic positioning that's about to become very interesting. As the first course was served and Trevor Ashford rose to begin his best man speech, I settled back in my chair with the calm anticipation of someone whose preparation was about to pay significant dividends. The evening's entertainment was about to begin, and I had front row seats to what promised to be a masterclass in the difference between perceived authority and actual competence. As dinner service concluded and the evening's formal program began, I found myself in the unique position of watching my family's carefully orchestrated humiliation strategy reach its crescendo while possessing complete information about how spectacularly it was about to backfire. The wedding coordinator, a harried woman with a headset and clipboard, was directing the transition from dinner to speeches with the precision of an air traffic controller managing peak holiday travel. Trevor Ashford stood near the head table, adjusting his bow tie and reviewing note cards with the focused intensity of someone preparing to deliver what he clearly believed would be a career-defining performance. From my vantage point at table 47, I could observe his pre-speech ritual, the confident handshakes with other head table guests, the casual mention of executive responsibilities in his conversations, and the way he positioned himself as the evening's authority on professional success and achievement. What made this moment particularly fascinating was watching my family's anticipation. Constance had positioned herself at a table with optimal sightlines to both the head table and my exile location, clearly expecting to enjoy the contrast between Trevor's celebrated expertise and my relegated status. Damien was beaming with the satisfaction of someone whose best friend was about to validate all his assumptions about success, competence, and social hierarchy. Uncle Raymond, who had arrived fashionably late and slightly drunk, had spent the cocktail hour loudly praising Trevor's executive insights to anyone who would listen. He had made a particular point of comparing Trevor's real-world business leadership to what he called the theoretical knowledge that people get from too much education and not enough practical experience. The positioning was so perfect it felt like destiny. Here was my family, publicly celebrating someone whose professional credentials were about to be definitively demolished, using his fabricated authority to justify their treatment of someone whose actual credentials they had never bothered to investigate. They had constructed their own trap with such precision that all I needed to do was wait for the appropriate moment to spring it. Trevor's speech began with the kind of confident energy that had probably served him well in sales meetings where nobody questioned his claims about decision-making authority. Good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Trevor Ashford, Damien's best man and, more importantly, his mentor in navigating the complex world of corporate leadership and professional development. He paused for the polite applause, his expression radiating the satisfaction of someone who believed he had successfully established his credentials in front of an audience that included several genuine business leaders. I've had the privilege of watching Damien grow from someone who was uncertain about his career direction into someone who understands what it takes to succeed in today's competitive business environment. As someone who deals with executive-level decision-making on a daily basis, I can tell you that success isn't about titles or education. It's about understanding how to identify opportunities, build relationships, and position yourself strategically within your industry. I glanced around the room, noting the expressions of the actual business executives in attendance. David Rothschild was listening with the polite attention of someone who had heard this type of generic leadership advice at dozens of networking events. Elizabeth Cavendish was checking her phone with the subtle impatience of someone whose time was being wasted by amateur-hour business philosophy. The corporate world can be challenging for young professionals who don't have guidance from people who've actually navigated these systems successfully, Trevor continued, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his theme. That's why mentorship is so important. When you have someone who can share real-world experience about managing teams, handling budgets, and making strategic decisions that affect entire departments, it makes all the difference. Rosa, the catering supervisor sitting beside me, leaned over with an expression of professional curiosity. Is this guy always this full of himself, or is this special occasion behavior? "This is actually pretty typical," I replied quietly, my eyes never leaving Trevor's performance. "Too many people in business today think that having a job automatically qualifies them to give advice about leadership and success," Trevor was saying, his tone becoming slightly more aggressive. "But there is a huge difference between someone who processes paperwork and someone who actually makes decisions that matter. Real executives understand that leadership isn't about following procedures. It's about having the authority and insight to shape how those procedures get implemented." The irony was so complete it was almost artistic. Here was someone whose daily responsibilities involved updating customer databases and scheduling routine sales calls, lecturing 300 wedding guests about the difference between real authority and bureaucratic procedure. But Trevor wasn't finished. As he moved into the portion of his speech specifically about Damien, he began incorporating subtle references to family dynamics that revealed just how deeply he had influenced my parents' perspective on appropriate social positioning. "Damien has learned something that many people struggle with: how to surround himself with people who can actually help him grow, rather than people who might hold him back through their own limitations or insecurities. Sometimes family relationships can be complicated, when not everyone operates at the same professional level, and it takes maturity to navigate those situations appropriately." The calculated cruelty of this reference wasn't lost on anyone at my table. Rosa's eyebrows rose sharply, and the photographer's assistant actually turned to stare at me with something approaching outrage. Even the bride's distant relatives, who had been politely ignoring the undercurrents of family tension, were beginning to recognize that this speech was veering into uncomfortable personal territory. As Damien continues to advance in his career, he'll need to make strategic decisions about which relationships serve his professional goals and which ones might require more careful management. That's not being disloyal to family. That's being realistic about how success actually works in the modern business world. I felt the familiar calm that always preceded moments of crucial decision-making. Trevor had not only misrepresented his professional credentials, but had used those fabricated credentials to publicly justify my family's treatment of me. He was delivering a speech about professional competence and strategic relationship management while demonstrating neither. Most importantly, he was doing all of this in front of an audience that included multiple people who could definitively verify the accuracy of his claims. The trap wasn't just set, it was already sprung. Trevor had committed himself so completely to his fabricated narrative that any correction would expose not just exaggeration, but systematic deception. He had positioned himself as the evening's authority on business success while sitting 15 feet away from his actual supervisor, whose performance evaluations documented his consistent failure to meet basic job requirements. As Trevor moved toward his conclusion, building to what was clearly intended to be an inspirational crescendo about achievement and recognition, I noticed several things happening simultaneously around the room. Victoria Ashbrook had arrived fashionably late and was standing near the back of the reception area, close enough to hear Trevor's speech and positioned where she could observe both the head table and my location. David Rothschild was no longer checking his phone, but was listening to Trevor with the focused attention of someone who had recognized that something interesting was about to happen. Elizabeth Cavendish had turned in her chair to look directly at me, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. My mother was still watching with satisfied anticipation, completely unaware that her evening's entertainment was about to take a dramatic turn in a direction she had never anticipated. Damien was nodding along with Trevor's speech, his expression radiating the confidence of someone whose worldview was about to be thoroughly validated. But the most telling detail was Trevor himself. As he approached the conclusion of his remarks, his body language radiated the satisfaction of someone who believed he had successfully established his authority and expertise in front of an audience that would remember this performance as evidence of his professional credibility. He had no idea that he had just delivered a 15-minute confession of professional misconduct to an audience that included his direct supervisor, multiple industry colleagues who could verify his actual credentials, and several business leaders who would remember this speech every time his name came up in future professional contexts. The moment of truth was approaching, and I was ready. Trevor reached the crescendo of his speech with the kind of theatrical flourish that would have been impressive if it weren't so completely divorced from reality. And that's what I want to say to all the young professionals here tonight. Success isn't about luck or connections. It's about demonstrating real competence, earning genuine authority, and having the courage to make decisions that actually matter. When you've experienced what it means to be responsible for major operational outcomes, when you've had to navigate complex business relationships and strategic planning at the executive level, you understand that leadership is about substance, not just presentation. The applause that followed was polite but lukewarm, the kind of response that suggested most of the audience had recognized this as generic motivational speaking rather than genuine insight. But Trevor interpreted it as validation, beaming with the satisfaction of someone who believed he had successfully established his expertise in front of an audience of peers. So let's raise our glasses to Damien and Anastasia, two people who understand the importance of building relationships with others who share their commitment to excellence and achievement. Here's to a marriage built on mutual respect, shared values, and the wisdom to surround yourselves with people who will support your continued success. As the guests raised their champagne flutes and began the ritual of toasting the happy couple, I made my decision. The moment had arrived with perfect timing and optimal positioning. Trevor had committed himself completely to his fabricated narrative. My family had publicly endorsed his credibility, and the audience included multiple witnesses who could verify every claim I was about to make. I stood up. The movement itself was unremarkable, just a woman at table 47 rising from her chair during the toast. But something about the deliberate precision of the gesture, the calm authority in my posture, caused a ripple of attention to spread outward from my position. Rosa, the catering supervisor, later told me that I moved, quote, like someone who was used to having rooms full of people pay attention when she decided to speak. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the reception area without being raised. It was the same tone I used in board meetings when I needed to redirect conversations that had strayed from productive territory. I believe there's been some confusion about professional credentials that should be clarified. The room fell silent with the kind of sudden, complete attention that occurs when people sense that something significant is about to happen. Trevor's expression shifted from satisfaction to confusion to the first flicker of genuine concern as he realized that the woman he had specifically arranged to exile from important conversations was now commanding the attention of the entire reception. "I'm Celeste Hartwell, and I need to address some inaccuracies in the information that's been shared this evening about business leadership and executive authority." I reached into my small evening bag and withdrew one of the folders Catherine had prepared, opening it with the same methodical precision I used when presenting quarterly reports to the board of directors. "Mr. Ashford has spoken eloquently about the importance of demonstrating real competence and earning genuine authority. I agree completely with that principle, which is why I think it's important for everyone to understand the actual scope of his professional responsibilities." Trevor's face had gone completely pale, but he couldn't interrupt without appearing defensive or unprofessional. He was trapped by his own rhetoric about substance and credentials. Trevor Ashford is employed by Meridian Industries as a sales coordination associate, a mid-level position that involves processing customer orders, updating contact databases, and scheduling routine sales appointments. His current annual performance review indicates significant deficiencies in time management, client communication, and adherence to company protocols. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would be discussed in professional circles for months to come. More specifically, Mr. Ashford has no budget authority, no supervisory responsibilities, and no involvement in strategic decision-making processes. His recent performance evaluation notes a pattern of misrepresenting his role to external contacts and attempting to exceed his actual authority in client interactions. I looked directly at Trevor, whose expression had progressed from pale concern to visible panic. These performance issues have resulted in a formal disciplinary review scheduled for Monday morning, which may result in termination of his employment. David Rothschild, who had been listening with growing amazement, suddenly stood up from his table. "Excuse me, did you say Meridian Industries? Are you telling us that you work for the same company as the best man?" "I don't work for Meridian Industries," I replied, my voice remaining perfectly calm. "I am Meridian Industries Regional Director for Eastern Operations. I oversee manufacturing facilities in 3 states, supervise a workforce of over 2,000 employees, and report directly to the company's executive committee." The reaction was immediate and decisive. Elizabeth Cavendish began laughing, not maliciously, but with the genuine amusement of someone who had just witnessed the most perfect example of professional irony she had ever encountered. "Celeste Hartwell," she announced to the room, "is the youngest regional director in Meridian Industries' 150-year history. She was featured on the cover of Industrial Leadership Quarterly last spring for her innovations in sustainable manufacturing practices." Victoria Ashbrook stepped forward from her position near the back of the reception area, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made a career of understanding business relationships and professional hierarchies. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard a speech about executive competence from a mid-level employee who reports to the woman his own family seated with the catering staff because they assumed she wasn't qualified for sophisticated business conversations." The impact was immediate and total. Guests who had been politely applauding Trevor's generic leadership advice were now staring back and forth between the head table and table 47, processing the magnitude of the reversal they had just witnessed. My mother's wine glass slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Her face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching horror as she realized that 34 years of assumptions about my professional limitations had just been demolished in front of 300 witnesses. Damien was frozen at the head table, his mouth slightly open, staring at me as if I were a complete stranger who had somehow infiltrated his wedding while wearing his sister's face. But the most devastating reaction came from Trevor himself. The confident executive posture collapsed entirely, replaced by the hunched shoulders and avoiding eye contact of someone who had just been exposed as a fraud in the most public way possible. He looked exactly like what he actually was, a mid-level employee who had been caught lying about his credentials to impress people who now knew the truth about both his fabricated authority and his actual professional competence. James Morrison from the State Department of Industrial Relations, who had been quietly observing from a corner table, stood up and began clapping slowly and deliberately. 30 years in business development," he announced to the room, "and I've never seen a more perfect demonstration of why credentials matter and why misrepresentation has consequences." The applause that followed wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping that had greeted Trevor's speech. It was the genuine recognition of professionals who had just witnessed someone demonstrate exactly the kind of calm competence and strategic thinking that actually characterized executive leadership. As the applause continued, I remained standing at table 47, maintaining the same composed demeanor I had displayed throughout Trevor's speech. I wasn't gloating or celebrating the humiliation of my family and their chosen expert on business success. I was simply standing in my truth, allowing reality to speak for itself after 34 years of being misrepresented, underestimated, and deliberately minimized. The evening's entertainment had reached its conclusion, but the consequences were just beginning. The silence that followed the applause was pregnant with the kind of tension that occurs when an entire room of people simultaneously realizes they have witnessed something that will fundamentally alter relationships and reputations. The wedding reception had transformed into something resembling a corporate boardroom where a hostile takeover had just been announced, and everyone was calculating how the new power structure would affect their own positions. Trevor Ashford remained frozen at the head table, his face the color of old parchment, apparently unable to process that his carefully constructed professional identity had been demolished by the one person in the room whose opinion carried actual authority over his employment. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass, and I noticed that several wedding guests at nearby tables were now staring at him with the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for traffic accidents. The first person to break the silence was Anastasia Corvelli, now Anastasia Hartwell, who had been watching this exchange with the sharp intelligence of someone whose legal training had taught her to recognize when fundamental assumptions about reality were being challenged. She rose from her chair at the head table with the grace of someone accustomed to navigating complex social situations. "Celeste," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the reception area, "I believe congratulations are in order. I had no idea we were in the presence of such distinguished business leadership tonight." She walked deliberately from the head table to where I stood at table 47, her wedding dress rustling against the chairs as she moved. When she reached me, she extended her hand not in the casual gesture typically exchanged between family members, but in the formal handshake of one professional acknowledging another. "I apologize for the seating arrangement," she continued, loud enough for the entire reception to hear. "If I had been properly informed about your professional status, this evening would have been organized very differently." The implications of her statement reverberated through the room like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Anastasia wasn't just acknowledging my credentials. She was publicly distancing herself from the decision-making process that had resulted in my exile to table 47. More importantly, she was establishing that the bride herself considered the evening's seating arrangements to have been based on inaccurate information. My mother finally found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I don't understand. Celeste, you never told us. You never said anything about being a director. You said you worked for a local company." "I do work for a local company, Mother. Meridian Industries has been headquartered in this region for 150 years. You never asked about the specifics of my role, and I learned long ago that sharing professional achievements with this family typically resulted in lectures about becoming, quote, too big for my britches." Uncle Raymond, who had spent the cocktail hour loudly praising Trevor's executive insights, attempted to recover some social footing. "Well, of course we're proud of Celeste's success. We always knew she was capable of significant accomplishments. Perhaps there was just some confusion about the details." Victoria Ashbrook, who had remained near the back of the reception area, stepped forward with the expression of someone who had decided that truth deserved a more thorough airing. "Actually, Mr. Hartwell, there wasn't any confusion. Your nephew's best man specifically advised your family about appropriate seating arrangements based on his assessment of Celeste's professional background. He represented himself as qualified to make such assessments based on his own executive experience and corporate expertise." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Trevor had not only misrepresented his own credentials, but had used those fabricated qualifications to advise my family about my social positioning. The systematic nature of the deception was becoming clear to everyone in the room. David Rothschild, who had been observing this exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing a masterclass in strategic communication, addressed Trevor directly. "Mr. Ashford, I'm curious about something. During your speech, you mentioned having experience with executive-level decision-making and budget authority. Could you clarify what specific decisions you've been involved in at Meridian Industries?" Trevor's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. The question wasn't hostile or accusatory. It was simply a request for clarification from one business professional to another. But Trevor was trapped by his own rhetoric. Any answer he gave would either be demonstrably false or would require him to admit that his entire speech had been based on fabricated credentials. The specific details of my responsibilities are confidential company information," he finally managed. Elizabeth Cavendish laughed outright at this response. "Confidential? Mr. Ashford, you just spent 15 minutes describing your executive responsibilities to 300 people. You discussed strategic planning, team management, and budget authority in considerable detail. Surely you can provide at least one specific example of a decision you've made or a team you've supervised." The silence stretched long enough for everyone to understand that no such example was forthcoming. Trevor's professional credibility wasn't just damaged, it was completely destroyed, and everyone present had witnessed the destruction. But the most devastating reaction came from Damien himself. My brother, who had built his entire relationship with Trevor on the assumption that he was being mentored by a successful executive, was staring at his best man with an expression of dawning comprehension and growing humiliation. "Trevor," Damien said, his voice barely audible, "you told me you supervised a team of 12 people. You said you had approval authority for contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." Those were projected responsibilities. Future opportunities that were under discussion. Future opportunities? Damien's voice was getting stronger, powered by the realization that he had been systematically deceived. "You've been giving me career advice for 8 months based on responsibilities you might have someday?" The personal betrayal was hitting Damien harder than the professional humiliation. He had trusted Trevor not just as a friend, but as a mentor, and that trust had been built on a foundation of lies that was now collapsing in front of his wedding guests. Thomas Aldridge from the Regional Manufacturing Council stood up from his table, his movement causing heads to turn throughout the reception area. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've all learned something valuable tonight about the importance of verifying credentials before accepting professional advice. Ms. Hartwell, I believe I speak for everyone here when I say that your demonstration of grace under pressure and your commitment to professional integrity are exactly the kind of leadership our business community needs." The applause that followed was different from anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the polite acknowledgement of a speech or the obligatory recognition of an introduction. It was the genuine respect of professionals who had watched someone handle a difficult situation with exactly the kind of competence and composure that characterized real leadership. But perhaps the most significant development was the reaction of other wedding guests who had initially been positioned as my social superiors. The Corvelli family relatives, the college friends, the business associates who had been strategically seated at tables that reflected their assumed importance in the social hierarchy. They were all looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and respect that represented a complete inversion of the evening's original power structure. My mother sat at her table staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. The woman she had dismissed as socially awkward and professionally limited had just commanded the attention and respect of an entire room full of accomplished people. The narrative she had constructed about my limitations hadn't just been challenged. It had been obliterated by observable reality. Uncle Raymond was nervously finishing his third drink, apparently trying to process how his lecture about theoretical knowledge versus practical experience had aged in the space of 15 minutes. And Trevor Ashford sat at the head table, no longer the confident executive mentor, but simply a mid-level employee whose lies had been exposed in the most public and humiliating way possible. His relationship with my brother was destroyed, his professional reputation was in ruins, and his employment prospects had diminished considerably in the span of a single conversation. The evening wasn't over, but the fundamental relationships and assumptions that had structured this family gathering had been permanently altered. Truth had emerged as the victor in a contest where lies had seemed to hold all the advantages, and everyone present had witnessed the victory. 6 months after Damien's wedding, I sat in my office on the 47th floor of the Pinnacle Tower, watching the morning sun paint the Thornfield River in shades of gold and amber, reflecting on how completely that single evening had transformed not just my family relationships but my entire approach to professional and personal authenticity. The wedding had been a catalyst, but the real work of building new foundations had taken place in the months that followed. Trevor Ashford's employment with Meridian Industries ended exactly as I had predicted. During our Monday morning meeting, he resigned rather than face formal termination proceedings. What I hadn't anticipated was the ripple effect his departure would have throughout our regional business community. Within weeks, stories about his misrepresentation had spread through professional networks, serving as a cautionary tale about the risks of building relationships on fabricated credentials. Victoria Ashbrook later told me that his name had become synonymous with the importance of credential verification in business networking circles. But Trevor's professional downfall was merely a footnote in a much larger story about truth, accountability, and the courage required to live authentically in environments that prefer comfortable lies to inconvenient realities. The immediate aftermath of the wedding had been challenging for my family in ways they hadn't anticipated. Constance found herself fielding questions from neighbors and social acquaintances who had heard various versions of the wedding story and wanted to understand how she had managed to raise such a successful daughter, while apparently knowing so little about her achievements. The cognitive dissonance between their public narrative about my limitations and the observable evidence of my professional competence created social situations that required significant mental gymnastics to navigate. Damien's recovery took longer. The revelation that his mentor and best friend had systematically deceived him about fundamental aspects of his identity and qualifications had shaken his confidence in his own judgment. More importantly, it forced him to confront the possibility that other relationships in his life might be built on similarly unstable foundations. He spent several weeks in a state of angry confusion before finally calling me to request a conversation. "Celeste, I need to understand something," he said during that first phone call, his voice carrying a vulnerability I hadn't heard since we were children. "How long have you been this successful? How long have I been wrong about everything?" The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and covered 34 years of family dynamics, professional development, and the systematic ways we had both learned to hide our authentic selves to maintain family equilibrium. Damien's honesty about his own insecurities and his willingness to examine how those insecurities had made him susceptible to Trevor's manipulation marked the beginning of the first genuine relationship we had ever had as adults. "I think I was so desperate to feel successful that I attached myself to someone who claimed to have achieved what I wanted," he admitted. "I never questioned Trevor's stories because I needed them to be true. It made me feel important by association." That conversation led to others, and gradually we built something that resembled a functional sibling relationship based on mutual respect rather than competition for parental approval. Damien began asking genuine questions about my work, not to challenge or diminish it, but because he was genuinely curious about how someone builds a career through competence rather than networking and social positioning. Anastasia, meanwhile, had proven to be an unexpected ally in navigating the family transformation. Her legal training made her naturally suspicious of unsupported claims, and she began asking pointed questions about other family narratives that might benefit from factual verification. Her presence at family gatherings created a buffer of rationality that made honest conversation possible for the first time in decades. The most significant change occurred with my mother, though it happened gradually and with considerable resistance. Constance's initial response to learning about my professional status was to feel betrayed that I had hidden my success from her. It took months of careful conversation to help her understand that I hadn't hidden anything. I had simply learned to avoid sharing information that consistently resulted in family tension and criticism. "But why didn't you tell us you were so important?" she asked during one particularly difficult conversation. "We could have been proud of you." "Mother, you had 34 years to ask about my work. You chose instead to assume that anything I accomplished was either insignificant or somehow threatening to family harmony. I learned to respect those choices." The breakthrough came when she finally acknowledged that her treatment of my achievements had been influenced by her own insecurities about education and professional success. Her generation of women had been taught to find their identity through their children's accomplishments, but only accomplishments that didn't challenge traditional gender roles or educational expectations. "I think I was afraid that if you became too successful, you'd look down on us," she admitted. "It was easier to keep you smaller than to risk feeling diminished by your growth." That conversation opened the door to others, and slowly we began building a relationship based on who we actually were rather than who we had always assumed each other to be. It wasn't easy, and it required constant vigilance to avoid falling back into old patterns, but it was genuine in a way our family relationships had never been before. The professional impact of the wedding extended far beyond my family circle. Word of the evening's events had spread through business networks, but rather than damaging my reputation, it had enhanced it. Industry colleagues viewed my handling of the situation as a demonstration of grace under pressure and commitment to professional integrity. Several potential clients specifically requested meetings because they had heard about my, quote, ability to maintain composure in challenging interpersonal situations. More importantly, the experience taught me valuable lessons about the cost of hiding authentic achievement to protect other people's comfort. I realized that my decades of strategic invisibility hadn't just hurt me. It had deprived my family of the opportunity to grow, to challenge their assumptions, and to develop relationships based on reality rather than wishful thinking. I began speaking more openly about my work, not to boast or intimidate, but to model what authentic professional success actually looks like. I started mentoring young women in manufacturing who were navigating similar dynamics with families who didn't understand their career choices. I joined boards of organizations focused on supporting women in leadership roles, sharing the lessons I had learned about maintaining professional integrity while managing complex family expectations. The wedding story became something of a legend in our business community, but not for the reasons people might expect. It wasn't remembered as a story about revenge or family conflict. It became a teaching example about the importance of authentic professional relationships, the risks of building career advice on fabricated credentials, and the power of truth to transform even the most entrenched social dynamics. Today, as I review quarterly reports and prepare for another board meeting, I'm struck by how fundamentally my life changed when I finally decided to stop accommodating other people's need for me to be smaller than I actually was. The professional skills that had made me successful in business, strategic thinking, calm decision-making under pressure, commitment to factual accuracy, proved equally valuable in personal relationships once I stopped apologizing for possessing them. The most meaningful outcome of that evening wasn't Trevor's professional downfall or my family's forced recognition of my achievements. It was the discovery that authentic relationships, while more challenging to build, are infinitely more satisfying than relationships based on mutual deception and strategic omission. Have you ever found yourself minimizing your achievements to protect other people's feelings? Have you encountered situations where telling the truth about your capabilities felt more dangerous than allowing misconceptions to persist? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply stand up and be exactly who we are, regardless of who that makes uncomfortable. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content about authentic leadership, professional integrity, and the courage required to live honestly in a world that often prefers comfortable fiction to challenging truth. Remember, your achievements don't diminish other people's worth, and other people's insecurities don't diminish your accomplishments. The truth has a way of creating space for everyone to grow, once we're brave enough to share it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.